Hey class, welcome back. We're diving into week 4. This week we are talking about aperture. Going to get into that in just a second. I hope you guys made it through last week relatively okay. We talked about shutter speed and we slowed down the shutter so that we could show that motion. And I talked a little bit about equivalencies. This week, we're going to talk about equivalencies again, but we're going to focus on the aperture because for this assignment, we want to try to achieve a certain effect, which is a shallow depth of field, and we'll talk about that right now. All right, class, we're going to go ahead and dive in. This lecture is up on Canvas. Feel free to follow along that as you watch the video. If you want, print it out if you want. At the very end of the lecture, there is that equivalency chart that shows the whole stops and the third stops, and we will go into that as well. When we talk about aperture, there is another phrase that goes hand in hand with the aperture, and that is called the depth of field. And I'm gonna show you some examples, and we're going to talk about that. Basically, what the depth of field is, the depth is your visual from your subject matter to everything behind that and in front of that. That is the depth. And the depth of field is anything that is in focus within that depth. And let's go ahead and let me see if I can explain it. First, aperture, this is going to be on your final. The definition, it's basically an opening, okay? It's a hole. If you look inside of your lens, you're going to see that it can open or close depending on which setting you have. The aperture is a component of the lens. It's not the camera. Remember, your DSLR cameras or your mirrorless cameras, they're two different components. You've got the camera body, and then on the lens, you've got the actual, the lens is a separate component, and on the lens, you've got your aperture. This aperture is a hole that can get either large or very small depending on the setting you choose. These numbers on your camera, if you were to go and find out how to change your aperture, and remember all makes and models are different, so you have to find out for your specific camera how to change the aperture setting on your camera. But just know that these numbers represent the size of the opening of your aperture, okay? I don't want to geek out on you and dive into what the F means and the 1.4. If you love that kind of stuff, feel free to go look it up. But just know that these numbers represent the size of the aperture for your lens, okay? So if you were to set your camera setting to f16, the opening of your aperture would be very small. Likewise, if you were to set your aperture to 1.4, the aperture or the opening would be very large. Most of your entry-level lenses can't get to 1.4. Probably most of you guys can get to f4 here, okay, or 5.6. If you have a pro lens, you could probably get to 2.8, or you can probably get down to 1.8 or 1.4. The size of this opening is going to determine how much light comes through. Remember, we talked about the eyes kind of as the same way as a camera. The eyelids are like the shutter speed. The pupils are like the aperture. The pupils will dilate, getting larger or smaller depending on how much light is in the room or how much light you need, okay? The next slide here I have shows a diagram of the aperture settings. It also shows the ISO and the shutter speed just for your own reference, but this week we are talking about aperture. So just notice that depending on which setting you choose for your aperture, this is the effect that you're going to achieve with the setting that you choose. So for f32 here, this little model is standing in front of the mountains. The person and the mountains is in focus. It's sharp. And then on the other end over here at f1.4, a really large opening, really large aperture, the person is sharp and in focus, and the background is really blurry. For this assignment, this is the effect that we're trying to achieve. And it doesn't have to be a person standing in front of a background or anything like that. Save that for the actual portrait assignment down the road. For most of your cameras, like I said, you'll probably only be able to achieve 5.6 or f4, and this will be the effect. that's totally fine, okay? Just know that each one of these numbers represents the opening. Let's talk about depth of field. The depth of field, like I said earlier, is the distance in an image where objects are in acceptable focus, okay? We use interchangeably words like sharp or in focus. Those two things go hand in hand. The depth of field is anything that is in focus from the very start of the field to the very end of that field, depending on which setting you choose. In this diagram, we have a cameraman taking a photograph of a bear. And you will notice that the right here says narrow depth of field. The narrow depth of field, that means that right here you can see the fall off. Just before it's blurry, and then just after this line, this is all blurry. And everything in this area right here, it is sharp or in focus. This is called a narrow depth of field. And to achieve something like this, I put the settings over here, something that you could try to choose, F2, F4, 5.6 if you want, okay? Down on this lower one, this is a large depth of field. So your field, think of it like a football field or whatever you want, the entire field from here, this point, all the way back to the mountains and the trees way back here, it's all in focus. This is a large depth of field. And to achieve a large depth of field, you want f16, f22, or even a smaller aperture than that. Remember, the larger the number here, the smaller the opening, okay? The smaller number, the larger opening. The larger the opening, the more light that comes through. This is some coins I set up in a home studio. You can see the foreground is very blurry, and then right before this penny here that's standing up, it starts to go in focus, and this is really sharp, and then the background, it falls off and it goes back to being blurry. So the depth of field for this photograph is right around the back of this penny, right to the front of this penny that's laying down. That's the depth of field, anything that is in focus. To achieve this, I probably use like an F2. I was really close to the subject. This next photograph was some raindrops on a hood of a car. I was walking around outside. Sometimes I like to do that and capture some really interesting shots when it's raining. Protect your camera if you ever do that. But you can see right here the foreground very blurry, and then it gets very sharp, and then it falls off and gets very blurry again. So the depth of field is just this area right here. Again, I was probably shooting like f4 maybe for this. The distance you are, let me go back to that original one. The distance you are standing from your subject matter matters as well. No pun. If you are really close to your subject matter, the depth of field is going to shrink. It's going to get smaller, no matter what setting you choose. But if you're further away, the depth of field is going to increase, no matter what setting you choose. Try this out. Find a pine cone. I do this for my first year students when I'm teaching this class live and in person. This is called the pine cone test, and I have them set a pine cone up, and I have them take a photograph of the pine cone at like f4 or f5.6, whatever their widest, largest aperture is. I have them take a photograph of a pine cone at their largest, widest aperture, like f4 or f5.6, whatever that is. And I have them take one photograph at about 20 feet away, take another photograph at 10 feet away, take a photograph at 5 feet away, and then take a photograph as close as they can and still being able to focus, and see what happens to the background as you move closer to that object. From far away, the background is kind of blurry, but as you get closer to that subject matter, without changing any of the settings, they keep the same settings. As you get closer to the subject matter, the background becomes much, much more blurry, okay? So just so you know, the depth of field is affected by the aperture, but also the distance you are from your subject matter. This model, I was very close to her. I had an 85mm prime lens, but I was relatively close, and you can see the background. It's really, really blurry. Just know when you shoot models for headshots, portraits, fashion, whatever, focus on their eye, the eye that is closest to the camera, and use maybe like an f5.6, f2.8, f4, something like that. Nail the focus on the eye, and you get this really nice soft fall off. On the other side of that, if you like to shoot landscape, maybe you like to shoot architecture or real estate, it doesn't even matter what the subject matter is. If you want a really large depth of field, like if you want everything in focus from the very front or the foreground to the very back, the background, you need a really large depth of field. You need a very small aperture. Okay. So I put up here some examples. You could choose f16, f22. Some of your lenses can go to f32 or smaller possibly, but just know if you're trying to get everything in focus, use a very small aperture like that. Again, at the very end of this lecture, I put the photo equivalency chart up here. You'll notice the whole stops and then the third stops here. You can print this out, take it out with you if you need to, and run through the equivalencies and just count it out like you do on your camera. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to Photoshop, and we're going to run through a demo on choosing the best aperture for this assignment. All right, so I've pulled up this equivalency chart in Photoshop because I want to run through an equivalency example with you. Let's go ahead and say that we want to go outside. We want to do this assignment, and we're going to go outside at 12 o'clock noon. All right. Now, you walk outside. You're not really sure what settings you want to choose. Remember the Sunny 16 rule just to get you going. Okay. The Sunny 16 rule states that if you set your aperture, and aperture is the f-stop, the f-stops is the aperture. And when we talk about f-stops, we're talking about this F right here, which stands for focal point. We're not going to dive into that and geek out and confuse you. But just know when we say f-stop, we're talking about this F right here. And the stop, remember what stop is? It's an increment value of an exposure, okay? So when I say f-stop, I'm talking about aperture. So we're going to go ahead and at noon, right, 12 o'clock, it's sunny outside. We're going to use the Sunny 16 rule. We're going to set our aperture at f16. And the rule states that whatever we set our shutter speed at, we can set our ISO at, and we will have a proper exposure. So let's go ahead and just choose 1/500th of a second. That means we're going to come over here and find our ISO 500. We're going to set our camera's ISO 500. So if we were to take an exposure right now, the Sunny 16 rule states that we should have a pretty good exposure, all right? Now, what aperture are we at right now? f16. What is the effect we're going to have? So if we were to choose an f-stop of f16 right now, we would have a very large depth of field. Everything would be in focus. But remember, for the assignment, we want to have a very shallow depth of field. So we need an aperture of around here, okay? Now, most of your lenses, like I said, can probably only go to f4 or 5.6, all right? All right, so let's go ahead and go back here, and we're going to choose f4. This color will represent the new exposure settings that we're going to choose. So let's think about what we just did. We're talking about our f-stop right now. The f-stop is the aperture. The aperture is what? It's a hole. It's an opening. We just made a change from f16 to f4. Is f16 a large opening or small opening? Small opening. f4 is a large opening. So think about what we just did. We went from a small opening to a large opening, allowing a lot more light to come in. If we were to take this photograph right now, this photograph would be overexposed. There'd be too much light in it. So we'd have to make settings on either the shutter speed or the ISO to compensate for that. Now let's go ahead and count this out as a photo equivalency. We're going to go ahead and go here. Let me choose my red color. From F16, let's just go ahead and count it out, okay? We're going to go 1 click on our dial. This is all on the camera, remember? 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks, 3 1/3 is 3/3, right? 3 clicks equals 1 whole stop. So from F16 to F11 is 1 whole stop of an exposure change. So I'm just going to write 1 here. And then from here, we're going to go 1, 2, 3. That's 2. And then 1, 2, 3. That's 3. And 1, 2, 3 more gets us to that F4.0, excuse me. So I'm going to go ahead and write 4 stops. This is really terrible. I need a stylus. Okay, you guys get the point. We just made a 4-stop exposure change to our aperture. That means we made 4 stops of more light coming in right now. That means we need to remove light from either the ISO or the shutter speed. We can go to the ISO and do that in 4 stops, or the shutter speed in 4 stops. We can do 2 over here, 2 over there, 3 and 1. It doesn't really matter, but we need a total of 4 stops changed from either the ISO, shutter speed, or a combination of both. Let's go ahead and go over to the ISO and let's lower this. Remember, the higher the ISO is more sensitive to light. The lower your ISO means less sensitive. So we want this to be less sensitive because we already have a lot of light coming in right now. So we're going to go 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks. 3/3 is 1. And we're going to go 1 more click, 1 more click, 1 more click. That's 3 more thirds. That's another. So that's actually 2 stops. And if we wanted to keep going, we'd have to go 3 more. But unfortunately, most of our cameras don't let us go below ISO 100. So we're going to leave this at, let's leave our ISO at 125. I'm going to go ahead and go here, make this, and we'll highlight that. Okay. So we found 2 stops of an exposure equivalency over here, but we need 4 totals. That means we need to go to our shutter speed and we need to find 2 more. 2 over here plus the 2 over the ISO, 2 plus 2 equals 4, which is our original 4-stop change value there. I'm sorry if I'm over explaining this. It's a bad habit, but I just really am trying to hope you guys, I'm not confusing you. Okay, let's go. So 1/500th. Remember, the camera is kind of like our eyes. The shutter is kind of like our eyelids. If we leave our eyelids open, that's a long shutter, more light comes in. If we blink really fast, not a lot of light comes in, right? Self-explanatory. From 500, if you go down 1/25th, 1/60th, 1/30th, these are considered slow shutter speeds, okay? Typically from 1/60th down or slower is considered a slow shutter speed. And 1/8000th is considered a really fast shutter speed. Anything above 1/500th is considered a fast shutter speed, all right? So we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to do? We're trying to remove light. So we can't lower our shutter speed, right? Because if we were to slow down our shutter speed, more light would come in. We need a faster shutter speed to reduce the light. And we already have 2 stops. That means we need 2 more over here. So let's go ahead and count this out. We need a faster shutter speed from 1/500th. On the dial, we're going to go 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks. 3/3 of a stop is 1. And we're going to go 1, 2 clicks, 3 more clicks, and there we have 2. So our, oh, I'm drawing this the wrong color. I'm so sorry, but you guys get it. I'm not going to do this again. Look, 1/200th of a shutter speed at f4 and ISO 125. That would be our new settings to get a proper exposure and the effect that we're trying to get for that shallow depth of field. Okay. If you need help, just go back over that, watch this video again, drink some coffee if that helps. I know I'm kind of boring to listen to. Go back over that equivalencies. If you need help, reach out, email me. We'll have a one-on-one Zoom, both of our cameras, and I can maybe walk you through some things and explain some things. Hopefully this makes sense and you get it. But if not, get out there, get out and practice. And once again, reach out if you have any questions. You guys, good luck on this assignment. I really, really hope I get some really fun, interesting things from you guys. Pro tip, don't shoot flowers. We're going to have 20 of you are going to turn in flowers. It's just a beginner thing that we do. We walk out of our house, we walk around, we want to take a photographs of something, and everybody loves flowers. I get it. We do. If you find like a flower that has never been photographed ever in the history of flowers, please photograph it. For this assignment, try to find something that has never been photographed or that probably will not be turned in. Okay, try to be original in this. Think of something fun. Think of something detailed, texture, close-ups. Photograph anything you want. I'm not going to say no to flowers, but just know maybe there's like a cool bug on it or a bee or something like that that makes it a little bit more interesting. Last thing, think of your perspective. Try not to shoot a photograph just standing like normal, okay? Bend down, get low to the ground, turn the camera sideways in portrait mode, move around and take a bunch of shots of this, whatever it is, overshoot it. That's what I tell everybody, overshoot everything. Take 100 photographs of this one thing from different angles, different perspectives, okay? You can't go wrong. Once you look at them in post-production and go through them, you'll have a lot more options to choose from. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. You guys, good luck. Have a good week.